Now, into this world, picture a woman. Not a quiet, demure English rose, bred for obedience and deference. No, picture a force of nature. An American with a Virginian drawl that could cut through the stuffiest of silences, and a wit as sharp and as dangerous as a shard of glass. A woman who, as the writer Truman Capote so brilliantly observed, was like a singing swan. Her presence was elegant, captivating, undeniably beautiful. But when she opened her mouth to sing her truth, the sound was so piercing, so unapologetically loud, and often so unnervingly dissonant that the whole lake want to run away. This is the story of that swan, a woman who didn't just ripple the waters of the British establishment. She created a tidal wave. Today we begin the epic, intricate, and deeply contradictory story of Lady Nancy Astor, the American rebel who stormed the mother of all parliaments, a pioneer who kicked open the door for women in politics, and a scandal-plagued icon whose legacy is as brilliant as it is tarnished. To understand the woman who would change British history, we must first journey back across the Atlantic to the soil that forged her fiery spirit, the Old Dominion, Virginia. Nancy Witcher Langhorne was born in Danville, Virginia, in 1879, into a world caught between the genteel decay of the Old South and the raw, rapacious energy of the Gilded Age. Her father, Chiswell Dabney Langhorne, known to everyone as Chili, was the embodiment of this new era. He was not old money. He was a man who had lost nearly everything in the Civil War and clawed his way back with ferocious ambition, building a fortune in railroads and construction. He was charismatic, dynamic, a brilliant businessman, but he was also a man haunted by demons. Chili Langhorne was a raging alcoholic, and his temper, fueled by whiskey, was a terrifying and unpredictable storm that raged through the family home. The Langhorne household, particularly their grand estate, Mirador, nestled at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains, was a place of breathtaking contradictions. On the surface, it was a picture of Southern grace and immense privilege. There were sprawling lawns, stables of fine horses, and a constant stream of visitors. Chili presided over it all like a feudal lord, generous and charming one moment, a tyrant the next. For Nancy and her four sisters, life at Mirador was a masterclass in survival, in learning to read the shifting moods of a powerful, volatile patriarch. Their mother, Nannerre, was the quiet anchor in this storm. A woman of gentle disposition, she tried to shield her children from the worst of their father's excesses, but the shadow of his addiction was inescapable. For Nancy, this chaotic upbringing was profoundly formative. It instilled in her a deep-seated hatred of alcohol, a conviction that it was the root of misery and destruction. This wasn't a political stance she would later adopt for convenience. It was a core belief forged in the fires of her childhood trauma. It would become the bedrock of her lifelong, often fanatical support for the temperance movement. Nancy was one of 5 beautiful Langhorne sisters, each one a star in her own right. But it was her elder sister, Irene, who was the true belle of the family. Irene was serene, graceful, and possessed a classical beauty so perfect that she became the muse for the artist Charles Dana Gibson. She was the original Gibson girl, the idealized image of American womanhood at the turn of the century, her face and figure gracing magazines and posters across the nation. Irene was everything society expected a young woman to be: poised, elegant, and demure. Nancy was not. Where Irene was calm, Nancy was a whirlwind of energy. She was sharp-tongued, impulsive, and possessed a rebellious streak a mile wide. While Irene charmed suitors with a gentle smile, Nancy would challenge them to a horse race and likely win. She was fiercely competitive, intelligent, and utterly impatient with the stuffy conventions of Southern society. Anecdotes from her youth paint a picture of a girl who simply refused to be contained. She was known for her clever, often cutting remarks and a fearlessness that both enchanted and alarmed those around her. This dynamic with her sister was crucial. Living in the shadow of the perfect Gibson girl, Nancy learned early on that her currency was not going to be quiet beauty, but dazzling, audacious personality. She couldn't out Irene, so she would have to become something else entirely, unforgettable. Her education was typical for a wealthy young woman of the time, more focused on social graces than academic rigor. She attended a finishing school in New York City, where she was reportedly a difficult and restless student. The classroom couldn't hold her attention. The world was her stage, and she was desperate for the play to begin. She was launched into society, a beautiful, witty, and slightly dangerous debutante. It was during this whirlwind of balls and high society courtship that she met the man who would become her first husband, a decision that would plunge her into the darkest chapter of her young life. The man was Robert Gould Shaw II. On paper, he was the perfect match. He was handsome, wealthy, and hailed from a prominent Boston Brahmin family, the pinnacle of American aristocracy. They were old money, intellectual, and deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of New England. For the Langhornes, who were still seen as ambitious new money Southerners, the union was a significant social coup. At just 18 years old, Nancy, swept up in the romance and the prestige of it all, married Shaw in 1897. The marriage was a catastrophe from the very beginning. The vibrant, free-spirited girl from the Virginia countryside was utterly suffocated by the rigid, emotionally sterile world of Boston's high society. Where she was spontaneous, they were reserved. Where she was outspoken, they were icily polite. She found their social rituals to be, in her own words, as cold as a Boston east wind. She was an exotic bird trapped in a gilded but freezing cage. But the social mismatch was the least of her problems. Robert Shaw, behind his handsome and sophisticated facade, was a man plagued by the same demon that had haunted her father. He was a severe alcoholic, prone to fits of jealousy, cruelty, and, according to many accounts, violence. The paradise she had imagined turned into a private hell. The laughter and energy that had defined her were slowly extinguished. She was isolated, lonely, and trapped in a toxic cycle of her husband's drinking and abuse. During this miserable union, she gave birth to a son, Robert Gould Shaw III, who she called Bobby. Motherhood brought her a flicker of joy, but it could not salvage the marriage. Nancy's vivacious spirit was being crushed. She later described this period with a chilling simplicity, saying she felt like she was living in a tomb. The girl who could outride and outtalk any man was reduced to a state of near constant anxiety and despair. For a woman of her time and class, divorce was almost unthinkable. It was a public admission of failure, a social stain that could never be washed away. A woman, especially one with a child, was expected to endure, to suffer in silence, to maintain the facade of a perfect marriage at all costs. But Nancy had inherited her father's iron will, if not his weaknesses. She could not and would not allow herself to be destroyed. Drawing on a reservoir of courage she perhaps didn't even know she possessed, she did the unthinkable. In 1903, after 6 years of misery, Nancy Astor filed for divorce. The scandal was immense. The divorce proceedings were fodder for gossip columns from Boston to Richmond. She was portrayed as a flighty Southern belle who couldn't handle the rigors of a respectable Boston life. But for Nancy, the public humiliation was a small price to pay for her freedom. She took her son, Bobby, and returned to the relative sanctuary of Mirador, a divorced woman at 24. In the eyes of society, her life was effectively over. She was damaged goods, a cautionary tale. But Nancy Langhorne Shaw was not one for writing herself off. This wasn't an ending. It was an intermission. Her second act, she decided, would not be in America. It would be across the ocean, on a much grander stage. In 1904, with her father's encouragement and financial backing, Nancy embarked on a trip to England. It was a well-trodden path for wealthy American women, who were often dubbed dollar princesses by a cynical British press. These heiresses, with their vast New World fortunes, would cross the Atlantic to marry into the British aristocracy, trading their money for a title and a place in a society steeped in history and prestige. Nancy, however, was not looking for a title. She was looking for a life. She arrived in England not as a timid debutante, but as a woman who had already lived through a lifetime of turmoil. This gave her an edge, a certain world-weariness mixed with an undiminished zest for life that the English aristocracy found both shocking and utterly intoxicating. She was an immediate sensation. Her American directness, which had been so jarring in Boston, was seen as refreshingly authentic in the more jaded circles of London society. Her wit was sharper than ever, honed by years of verbal sparring and personal pain. She was beautiful, she was rich, and she had a tragic backstory. She was, in short, irresistible. She quickly fell in with a set of prominent figures, including the author Henry James and the politician Lord Curzon. They were fascinated by this vivacious American divorcee who said precisely what she thought, often with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. She was a brilliant conversationalist and a superb horsewoman, qualities that were highly prized in Edwardian England. She was hunting, attending house parties, and dazzling drawing rooms across the country. And it was at one of these gatherings that she met the man who would fundamentally change the course of her life, Waldorf Astor. Waldorf was, in every conceivable way, the antithesis of her first husband. He was the son of William Waldorf Astor, one of the richest men in the world, an American who had moved to England and become a naturalized British subject. Waldorf himself was born in America but raised and educated in England at Eton and Oxford. He was serious, thoughtful, kind, and deeply principled. He was also, like Nancy, a teetotaler. He didn't have the flashy charisma of other suitors, but he possessed a quiet strength, an integrity, and an intelligence that Nancy found herself profoundly drawn to. Their courtship was a meeting of minds and spirits. Waldorf was captivated by her energy and intelligence, and Nancy, for the first time, felt truly seen and respected by a man. He saw beyond the scandalous divorcee and the witty socialite. He saw the depth, the vulnerability, and the immense potential within her. He proposed to her, and despite some initial reluctance from his father, who was wary of Nancy's divorce status, they were married in 1906. With this marriage, Nancy Witcher Langhorne became Nancy Astor, future Viscountess Astor. She was now the mistress of Cliveden, a breathtakingly grand stately home overlooking the River Thames, which Waldorf's father gifted them as a wedding present. She was at the helm of one of the most powerful and influential families in the Anglo-American world. The Astor name gave her a platform of unimaginable scale, but it was during this period of newfound happiness and stability that Nancy underwent another profound transformation, one that was intensely personal and would shape her public life in ways no one could have predicted. She discovered Christian Science. After a period of ill health and spiritual searching, she was introduced to the teachings of Mary Baker Eddy, which emphasized the power of prayer and mind over physical ailment. For a woman who had felt so powerless in her first marriage, a faith that promised spiritual control and a direct personal connection to God, was a revelation. Christian Science offered her a framework for life, a rigid moral code that appealed to her disciplined nature. It reinforced her views on temperance and gave her a sense of righteous certainty that would become a hallmark of her political career. It was a demanding, ascetic faith, but for Nancy, it was a source of immense strength and clarity. It settled her restless soul and armed her with a divine conviction. She was no longer just a wealthy socialite. She felt she was a woman with a mission. She had a new husband, a new home, a new name, and a new faith. The stage was now set for her most audacious performance yet. All she needed was an opening. And in the tumultuous aftermath of the First World War, that opening would present itself in the most unexpected of ways. We left Nancy Astor as a woman reborn. She had escaped the wreckage of her first marriage and the confines of American society, remarrying into one of the wealthiest and most influential families in England. As the new mistress of Cliveden, with a devoted husband in Waldorf and a new galvanizing faith in Christian Science, she had found a security in a platform she could only have dreamed of. For a time, her life was a whirlwind of hosting lavish parties, raising a growing family. She and Waldorf would have 5 children together, and cementing her reputation as one of the most dazzling, if sometimes difficult, hostesses in Edwardian England. But the gilded world she now inhabited, a world of garden parties, political dinners, and country weekends, was living on borrowed time. The storm clouds of war were gathering over Europe, and in 1914, that storm broke. The Great War would not just redraw the maps of nations, it would shatter old certainties, upend the social order, and transform the lives of millions, including the Viscountess in her stately home. For Nancy Astor, the war would be more than a national tragedy. It would be a crucible, forging a new sense of purpose within her and paving an unexpected path from the drawing room directly to the door of the House of Commons. When war was declared, the opulence of Cliveden seemed almost obscene in the face of the impending slaughter. Nancy, with her characteristic energy and pragmatism, could not sit idly by. She and Waldorf made a decision that would change the estate and their lives forever. They offered Cliveden to the war effort, and a significant portion of their magnificent home was converted into a fully equipped hospital for wounded Canadian soldiers, known as the Duchess of Connaught Red Cross Hospital. Nancy threw herself into running the hospital with a ferocious dedication. This was not a symbolic hands-off patronage. She was on the wards day in and day out, an organizing dynamo and a surprisingly tender presence. She would read to the men, write letters home for them, and use her sharp wit to coax smiles from soldiers broken in body and spirit. She was both commander-in-chief and matron, ensuring the hospital ran with ruthless efficiency while also providing a very personal human touch. One soldier recalled that she was a ministering angel, while another noted her practical, no-nonsense approach, saying she would curse like a trooper and pray like a saint. This experience was transformative. It took her far beyond the rarefied air of the aristocracy and exposed her to the raw suffering and quiet heroism of ordinary men. It gave her a profound sense of public duty and proved to herself and to others that she was far more than a witty socialite. She was a leader, an organizer, a woman of immense grit and compassion. As the war drew to a close in 1918, Britain was a nation in mourning, but also a nation in flux. The old world had been swept away. Social barriers had begun to crumble, and a spirit of change was in the air. One of the most significant changes was the Representation of the People Act, which, for the first time, granted the vote to millions of women over the age of 30. A new political voice had been unleashed, even if the corridors of power themselves remained exclusively male. It was into this new world that a personal change in the Astor family's life suddenly took on national significance. In October 1919, Waldorf's father, the first Viscount Astor, died in his sleep. By the laws of British primogeniture, Waldorf automatically inherited the title. He was now the second Viscount Astor. While this elevated him in the aristocratic hierarchy, it came with a significant political consequence. A peer of the realm could not sit in the elected House of Commons. His place was in the unelected, hereditary House of Lords. His seat in Parliament, representing the constituency of Plymouth Sutton, a naval town he had served with dedication, was now vacant. A by-election would have to be called. For Waldorf, this was a devastating blow. He loved the rough and tumble of the Commons and his connection to the people of Plymouth. The move to the gilded chamber of the Lords felt like being put out to pasture. The Astors were faced with a dilemma. How could they maintain their influence and their commitment to public service in Plymouth? They discussed potential candidates who could carry on Waldorf's work, but no one seemed quite right. And then a truly radical idea began to take shape. It might have been first suggested in jest, but it quickly gained a serious momentum. If Waldorf could no longer hold the seat, why not his wife? Why not Nancy? The suggestion was audacious, almost ludicrous. The Parliament Qualification of Women Act 1918 had made it legal for women to stand as candidates, and in the general election of that year, Countess Constance Markievicz had been the first woman elected. However, as a member of the Irish Nationalist Party Sinn Féin, she had followed their policy of abstentionism and refused to take her seat. The chair reserved for the first female MP remained empty. The barrier had been cracked, but not broken. For Nancy to run was a gamble of epic proportions. She was a woman in a man's world. She was an American, a foreigner in the eyes of many. She was a divorcee, a status that still carried a heavy stigma. She was fantastically wealthy, which opened her up to accusations of trying to buy her way into power. And her fervent Christian Science faith was viewed with suspicion by a skeptical public. She was, in essence, the perfect target. Initially, even Nancy was hesitant. She was a mother of 6, and the prospect of facing the brutal, male-dominated world of politics was daunting. But Waldorf's encouragement was unwavering. He believed in her intelligence, her strength, and her unique ability to connect with people. He saw this as a way for them to continue their work as a partnership. Bolstered by his faith in her and fueled by her own restless ambition, Nancy agreed. The Viscountess Astor would stand for Parliament. The by-election campaign of November 1919 was one of the most sensational in British political history. It became an immediate national spectacle. Nancy, running as the coalition Conservative candidate, faced a Labour candidate, Isaac Foote, and a Liberal. From the moment she entered the race, the attacks were relentless and deeply personal. The sexism was blatant and ugly. Hecklers shouted that her place was at home with her children. One newspaper cartoon depicted a nursery with a sign on the door, MP, Mother of Parliament, implying she was simply trading one domestic role for another. She was condescendingly referred to as the lady, a title meant to highlight her supposed fragility and unsuitability for the grimy business of politics. Her American origins were used as a weapon against her. She was painted as a meddling outsider who knew nothing of the struggles of the British working class. Her wealth was a constant line of attack. At one rally, a man shouted, "What do you know about poverty? You're covered in jewels." Without missing a beat, Nancy shot back, "I may be covered in jewels, but I've got a heart of gold. At another, when a heckler yelled, "You're just trying to buy this seat?" she retorted, "If I were trying to buy it, don't you think I'd have chosen a more glamorous one than Plymouth?" Her wit became her greatest weapon. She didn't just endure the heckling, she thrived on it. She would often wade into the most hostile crowds, single out the loudest heckler, and engage them in a verbal duel she almost always won, leaving the crowd laughing and cheering. She was a natural-born campaigner, utterly fearless and brimming with a charismatic energy that was impossible to ignore. She held over 200 meetings, often speaking from open-air platforms in the rain, her voice hoarse, but her spirit undimmed. Crucially, she made a direct appeal to the newly enfranchised women of Plymouth. She held women-only meetings, creating a space where they could speak freely about their concerns: the high price of milk, the lack of decent housing, the need for better schools, and the devastating impact of alcohol on their families. On this last point, Nancy was a fire and brimstone preacher. Her campaign for temperance was not just a political policy, it was a moral crusade. She promised to be a voice for the women and children, to bring a mother's perspective to the heart of government. Her slogan, plastered across Plymouth, was simple and revolutionary: "Vote for the lady." On November 28, 1919, the votes were cast. The nation held its breath. When the results were announced, Nancy Astor had won a resounding victory, securing more votes than the Labor and Liberal candidates combined. She had done it. The American divorcee, the society hostess, the sharp-tongued firebrand from Virginia was going to Parliament. Her arrival at the Palace of Westminster on December 1st was a moment for the history books. Imagine the scene: the hallowed chamber of the House of Commons, a sea of over 700 men in dark suits, a place that had operated as an exclusive male sanctuary for centuries. And then through the door walked Nancy Astor. She was elegantly dressed, but her expression was one of grim determination. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of curiosity and palpable hostility. As she walked to take the oath, flanked by Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Conservative leader Arthur Balfour, a stony silence fell over the chamber. There was no welcoming applause. Many MPs pointedly turned their backs on her. She was an alien presence, a disruption to their world. The first few months were, in her own words, hell. The institution was simply not designed for a woman. The institution itself was physically and culturally hostile. There were virtually no amenities for a female MP. The place was a labyrinth of smoking rooms and bars, designed entirely for men. She famously described her initial feeling upon entering the chamber as if she were entering a tomb, a cold, silent, and unwelcoming place for a woman. There was no one for her to sit with in the members' dining room. Men would get up and move tables if she approached. The old boys' network froze her out completely. She was profoundly, painfully isolated. She once said, "When I stood up to speak, I could feel the hostility of the men. It was something you could have cut with a knife. They didn't want a woman there." But Nancy had not survived a traumatic childhood, a disastrous marriage, and a brutal election campaign to be defeated by hostile silence. She endured. She would sit through entire debates, absorbing the arcane rules and procedures of the House. And when she finally rose to make her maiden speech in February 1920, she confounded her critics. Instead of a fiery, radical tirade, she delivered a speech that was witty, self-deprecating, and passionately argued, focusing on her signature issue, the dangers of alcohol and the need for stricter liquor control. She disarmed many of them with her humor, while impressing others with her command of the subject. She had survived the entry. She had taken her seat, a lone woman in a sea of men. The glass ceiling of British politics had not just been cracked, it had been decisively shattered. But holding her ground and making her voice heard would be a different battle altogether. She had won the election, but the fight to be accepted, to be effective, and to wield real influence inside the corridors of power had only just begun. It would be a fight that would define the next century of her life, bringing her into conflict with the most powerful men in the country and cementing her reputation as both a beloved pioneer and a deeply controversial figure. We left Nancy Astor on the threshold of history, having survived the brutal gauntlet of a public election and the icy reception of the House of Commons. She had taken her seat. The silence had been broken, the door kicked open. But as the initial shock of her presence wore off, it was replaced by a far greater challenge: the day-to-day, year-on-year grind of being a working politician. For the first 2 years of her tenure, she was utterly alone, the sole female voice in a chamber of over 700 men. Every word she spoke, every question she asked, every vote she cast was freighted with a symbolic weight that no male EMP ever had to bear. She wasn't just representing the people of Plymouth Sutton, she was by default representing the entire female population of Great Britain. It was an immense, suffocating pressure. A misstep would not be just her failure, but a failure used as evidence that women were not suited for the political arena. But Nancy Astor was not a woman who wilted under pressure. She thrived on it. She would now transform herself from a political curiosity into a parliamentary force, a champion for the causes she held dear, and a ferocious sparring partner to the most powerful men in the nation. Once inside Parliament, Nancy quickly carved out her political territory. She had little interest in the grand geopolitical maneuvering of the empire or complex economic theories. Her focus was laser-sharp, aimed squarely at social reform and the issues that directly affected women, children, and families. She saw herself not as a politician in the traditional sense, but as a kind of national housekeeper, tasked with cleaning up the social ills that the men in charge had ignored for centuries. Her greatest and most defining crusade was against what she called the demon drink. Drawing on the trauma of her father's and first husband's alcoholism, she pursued the cause of temperance with the zeal of a missionary. This was not a popular position in the hard-drinking culture of Westminster, but she was relentless. Her crowning legislative achievement came in 1923 when she successfully introduced a private member's bill that became the Intoxicating Liquor Sale to Persons Under 18 Act against fierce opposition. She championed the bill, which specifically targeted and succeeded in prohibiting on-premises sales of alcohol to those under 18, a significant tightening of the law. Her other great passion was the welfare of children. She was a tireless advocate for the establishment of nursery schools, arguing that providing a safe, nurturing, and educational environment for the children of the working poor was the single most important investment the state could make. She saw it as a way to break the cycle of poverty and give every child a fair start in life. She hounded ministers, gave impassioned speeches, and used her platform to champion a cause that few others were talking about. As a constituency MP for the Naval Port of Plymouth, she was also a fierce advocate for the Navy and its sailors, fighting for better pay and pensions. She was remarkably diligent, spending countless hours dealing with the individual problems of her constituents. But her style in the chamber was anything but conventional. She was not a master of the long, eloquent, formally structured speech. Her power lay in the interruption. From her seat on the back benches, she became the sharpest, wittiest, and most feared heckler in the House. A well-timed, cutting interjection from Lady Astor could derail a minister's speech puncture pomposity, and swing the mood of the entire chamber. It earned her many enemies, who saw her as an ill-disciplined nuisance, but it also made her a darling of the press gallery and a voice that could not be ignored. She was shaping a new kind of political persona, outspoken, moralistic, and utterly unintimidated. This combative, self-assured style made her an effective champion for her causes, but it also guaranteed she would make powerful enemies. And in the House of Commons there was no enemy more powerful, nor any sparring partner more formidable than Winston Churchill. In the political ecosystem of the House of Commons, every formidable creature eventually meets its rival. For Nancy Astor, that rival was Winston Churchill. Theirs was one of the most legendary and electrifying feuds in 20th century British politics. It was a clash of titans, a collision of two enormous personalities who were in almost every way polar opposites. Churchill was the embodiment of the aristocratic patriarchal establishment. He was a man who adored tradition, the British Empire, and his brandy and cigars. He was a master of grand rhetoric, a historian who saw the world as a great strategic battlefield. Nancy Astor was the modernist, the American disruptor, a teetotaling Christian scientist who saw the world through the lens of moral and social purity. To her, Churchill represented everything she had come into politics to challenge: the casual sexism, the old boys club mentality, and the glorification of drink and war. To him, she was an aggravating, self-righteous Puritan, a foreign upstart who didn't understand the nuances of the British way of life. Their battles in the Commons were legendary. As two of the chamber's most skilled hecklers, they frequently turned their verbal artillery on each other. The air would crackle with anticipation when Churchill was speaking and Astor was in her seat, or vice versa. Each knew the other's weaknesses and targeted them with surgical precision. She would attack his love of alcohol and his traditionalist views. He would mock her American accent and her prohibitionist zeal. But their animosity wasn't confined to the debating chamber. It spilled over into the dinner parties and country house weekends, where they were often forced to socialize. It was in one such setting that their rivalry was immortalized in a now legendary, though likely apocryphal, exchange of insults. The exact time and place are debated. Some say it was at Blenheim Palace, others at a dinner party, but the content is undisputed. Exasperated by one of Churchill's pronouncements, Nancy leaned over and said, "Winston, if I were your wife, I would put poison in your coffee." The entire table fell silent. It was a shocking, audacious thing to say, but Churchill, a master of the swift retort, didn't miss a beat. He took a puff of his cigar, looked her coolly in the eye, and replied, "Nancy, if I were your husband, I would drink it." The line was devastatingly brilliant, and it perfectly encapsulated their relationship, a mixture of genuine dislike, intellectual combat, and a strange grudging respect for a worthy opponent. But their feud was more than just a clash of personalities. It was a proxy war for the soul of the Conservative Party and the future of Britain. They disagreed profoundly on nearly every major issue: the role of the state in social welfare, the future of the empire, particularly the question of Indian independence, and, most fatefully, how to deal with the rising threat of totalitarianism in Europe. As the 1930s dawned, this last disagreement would escalate from a parliamentary squabble into a chasm of principle that would place them on opposite sides of the most critical question of their time. But her clashes with Churchill were just one facet of a more complex and troubling side of her public persona. The very qualities that made her a groundbreaking politician, her unshakable self-confidence, her moral certainty, were also the source of her greatest flaws. Behind the image of the pioneering MP for women and children, a pattern of deeply ingrained prejudice was beginning to emerge, one that would permanently tarnish her legacy. The very qualities that made Nancy Astor a groundbreaking politician, her unshakable self-confidence, her moral certainty, her willingness to speak her mind regardless of the consequences, were also the source of her greatest flaws. Her passionate convictions often curdled into ugly prejudices, and her voice, once a clarion call for reform, began to hit some truly discordant and disturbing notes. One of her most pronounced prejudices was a virulent anti-Catholicism. She harbored a deep-seated suspicion and dislike of the Catholic Church, which she saw as a sinister, authoritarian, and anti-British institution. She voiced these views openly and offensively, at one point declaring in the Commons that a Catholic conspiracy was the greatest danger in the world. This alienated potential allies and revealed a shockingly intolerant streak in a woman who championed the rights of so many others. Even more damaging, and what would permanently tarnish her legacy, was her anti-Semitism. Like many in her aristocratic circle, she was prone to using the casual, insidious anti-Semitic language of the era. But with Nancy, it often went beyond casual prejudice. She engaged in public feuds with Jewish MPs and was known to make cutting remarks in private that betrayed a deeper vein of intolerance. She once reportedly told a political rival, "The Jews are responsible for all the troubles of the world," a statement so extreme it shocked even those accustomed to her outrageous pronouncements. This was not just a minor character flaw. It was a profound moral blindness that would have devastating implications for her political judgment as the international situation darkened. This blindness extended to her initial views on the rise of fascism. Like a number of upper-class Britons, Nancy was pathologically terrified of Soviet communism. She saw Stalin's godless, revolutionary Bolshevism as the ultimate threat to Western civilization. In contrast, the fascist regimes of Mussolini and initially Hitler seemed to her to be a source of order and a necessary bulwark against the communist tide. She was dangerously naive about the true nature of Nazism, admiring the apparent discipline and anti-communist fervor while conveniently overlooking the brutal totalitarianism and rabid anti-Semitism at its core. The singing Swan, the pioneer who had brought so much energy and a fresh perspective to British politics, was now singing a song that was becoming increasingly out of tune with the grim realities of the world. Her moral compass, so certain and true, on issues like temperance and child welfare, was proving to be terrifyingly flawed on the great questions of tolerance and foreign policy. This complex, contradictory mix of pioneering progressivism and reactionary prejudice would soon coalesce around her and her influential friends, creating a firestorm of controversy that would dog her for the rest of her life and forever associate her name with one of the most infamous political labels of the 20th century, the Cliveden Set. We left Nancy Astor as a paradox, a celebrated parliamentary pioneer, and a figure of growing controversy. Her righteous campaigns for social good were increasingly overshadowed by her shocking prejudices. Her legendary feud with Winston Churchill was not merely a clash of personalities, but a prelude to a far deeper, more consequential ideological battle. As the 1930s unfolded, the world began to slide inexorably towards another cataclysm. The economic ruin of the Great Depression fueled the rise of extremist ideologies, and the collective trauma of the First World War cast a long, dark shadow over a generation of politicians in Britain. Above all else, they shared one profound overriding desire: to avoid another war. This fear, this desperate hope for peace at almost any price, would become the political and psychological landscape upon which Nancy Astor would make the most catastrophic misjudgments of her career. Her magnificent home, Cliveden, once the glittering stage for her social triumphs, was about to become the symbol of a deeply flawed and dangerous political philosophy, forever tainting her name and the names of all who gathered there. In the 1930s, Cliveden House was more than just a stately home. It was the unofficial nerve center of the British establishment. A weekend invitation from the Astors was one of the most sought-after invitations in the world. Here, in the opulent drawing rooms and on the magnificent sprawling terraces overlooking the Thames, the course of British politics was debated, shaped, and influenced, far from the formal confines of Westminster. Nancy presided over this domain like a queen holding court. She was a masterful, if sometimes tyrannical, hostess. She had a unique genius for bringing together a dizzying array of powerful and brilliant people. A typical weekend at Cliveden might include the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, discussing policy with the editor of the Times, Geoffrey Dawson. The American ambassador, Joseph P. Kennedy, might be locked in conversation with a leading intellectual like George Bernard Shaw, while Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, played tennis with a young, up-and-coming politician. Nancy, a whirlwind of energy, would move between these groups, provoking arguments, brokering introductions, and ensuring that the conversations were never dull. She was the catalyst, the central force around which this galaxy of power revolved. Her influence was informal but immense. While she held no cabinet post, her access was unparalleled. She had the ear of the most powerful men in the country, and she was never shy about sharing her opinions. The discussions that took place over dinner at Cliveden on a Saturday night would often echo in the parliamentary debates and newspaper editorials the following week. It was a world of immense privilege, where policy was molded through personal relationships and informal consensus. And the consensus that began to form at Cliveden in the mid-1930s was one that would have fateful consequences for the entire world: the policy of appeasement. The prevailing view among Nancy and her powerful friends was that Germany had been unfairly punished by the Treaty of Versailles after the First War. They believed that Hitler's demands, at least initially, were reasonable, and that accommodating them, allowing Germany to reclaim lost territory and rebuild its military, was the surest way to correct past injustices and secure a lasting peace. This view was amplified by their profound fear of Soviet communism. They saw Hitler, for all his vulgarity, as a necessary evil, a strong leader who could act as a bulwark against the westward spread of Stalin's Bolshevism. They were, in the main, decent people, patriots who genuinely believed they were acting in Britain's best interest. They were also catastrophically wrong. As this pro-appeasement sentiment grew stronger within the Astor circle, it began to draw suspicion from those who saw Hitler not as a reasonable statesman, but as a dangerous megalomaniac. The first to give this suspicion a name and turn it into a full-blown political scandal was a radical journalist named Claude Cockburn. In his small but influential communist newsletter, The Week, Cockburn began publishing explosive articles. In 1937, he alleged that there was not just a general mood of appeasement at Cliveden, but a formal, organized conspiracy. He gave this alleged conspiracy a catchy and sinister-sounding name, the Cliveden Set. Cockburn painted a picture of a cabal of pro-Nazi aristocrats, led by Lady Astor, who were secretly pulling the strings of the British government. He claimed they were manipulating Prime Minister Chamberlain and directing foreign policy from behind the scenes, all with the aim of selling out Britain's allies in forging an alliance with Hitler's Germany. He portrayed them as the shadow cabinet, a group of unelected elites betraying British democracy for their own class interests. The accusation was a masterpiece of political propaganda. The reality, as is often the case, was far more nuanced. There was no formal set with a membership list and a secret agenda. The gatherings at Cliveden were more varied than Cockburn suggested, and guests with anti-appeasement views were also invited. But the label was devastatingly effective because it contained a powerful kernel of truth. The dominant political view at Cliveden, passionately articulated by Nancy and her closest confidants like Lord Lothian and Lord Halifax, was undeniably in favor of appeasing Germany. Foreign dignitaries who visited, like the German ambassador Joachim von Ribbentrop, left believing that the Astor's circle represented the true voice of the British government. The Cliveden Set tag stuck. It spread from Cockburn's newsletter to the mainstream press and into the public consciousness. In cartoons, Nancy was often depicted as a puppet master, with government ministers dangling from her strings. Cliveden, once a symbol of glamour and influence, became shorthand for aristocratic treachery and pro-fascist sympathies. For Nancy, who saw herself as a patriot, acting to save a generation from the horrors of war, the accusation was a source of profound and lasting bitterness. But her own actions and her own profound lack of political judgment had given her enemies all the ammunition they needed. Convinced of the righteousness of her cause, Nancy embarked on a series of misguided attempts at personal diplomacy. Along with Waldorf and other members of her circle, she visited Germany. This pro-appeasement ideology was reinforced by direct contacts. The Astor Circle was known to engage with Nazi officials as part of its informal diplomacy, most notably the German ambassador Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was a frequent guest at Cliveden. These interactions created a dangerous echo chamber, strengthening their misguided belief that the Nazi regime could be reasoned with. By her own accounts, she was personally repulsed by him, finding him to be a vain and unremarkable man. Yet, this personal revulsion did not shake her political conviction that he was a man with whom Britain could and should do business. It was a staggering failure to comprehend the true nature of the evil she was facing, a blindness born from her own prejudices and her desperate desire for peace. The Cliveden ideology found its ultimate expression in the policies of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Nancy was one of his most fervent and vocal supporters. As Hitler annexed Austria in the Anschluss of March 1938, and then turned his attention to the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, the Cliveden Group urged Chamberlain to negotiate, to concede, to do whatever was necessary to avoid a confrontation. Their viewpoint was amplified by their allies in the press, most notably the Times. The crisis reached its peak in September 1938 at the Munich Conference. Chamberlain met with Hitler and agreed to the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a promise of peace. When he returned to Britain, waving a piece of paper and famously declaring he had secured peace for our time, Nancy and her circle were ecstatic. They saw him as a hero, a savior, who had looked into the abyss of war and pulled the world back from the brink. Cliveden was a house of celebration and profound relief. They genuinely believed they had succeeded. This view, of course, was in stark opposition to that of Winston Churchill and his small band of anti-appeasers. To them, Munich was not a triumph, but a total and unmitigated defeat. It was a shameful betrayal of a democratic ally and a catastrophic misreading of Hitler's limitless ambition. They argued that by feeding the crocodile, Britain had not satisfied its appetite, but merely made it stronger and more confident for its next meal. For a few short months, it seemed as if Nancy Astor and the appeasers had been vindicated. The threat of war receded, but their triumph was a delusion built on a foundation of lies. In March 1939, Hitler's armies marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia, violating the Munich Agreement and shattering the policy of appeasement beyond repair. The peace for our time had lasted less than 6 months. The scales fell from the eyes of the British public and its politicians. Churchill had been right. The Cliveden Set had been catastrophically wrong. Their reputation was in ruins, and Nancy Astor, its most famous and outspoken advocate, was now a deeply discredited figure. War was no longer a distant threat. It was a certainty, and the world was about to be plunged into darkness. We left Nancy Astor at the precipice of a global catastrophe. The policy of appeasement, which she had so passionately championed from the drawing rooms of Cliveden, had collapsed in ignominy. Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 proved her great adversary, Winston Churchill, to have been right all along. The name Cliveden Set was no longer just a piece of political gossip. It was a damning indictment, a synonym for delusion and disgrace. On September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the inevitable finally happened. Britain declared war. For Nancy, this was the ultimate failure. The cause to which she had dedicated the last several years of her influence, the preservation of peace, was in ruins. The world was once again at war, and she was now inextricably linked to the very policies that had failed to prevent it. As the nation rallied for a fight for its survival, Lady Astor, the once celebrated pioneer, found herself in the political wilderness. Her voice diminished, her reputation shattered, and her greatest enemy about to take center stage. The early phase of the war, the phony war, saw Neville Chamberlain's government stagger on, but his authority was gone. In May 1940, following a disastrous campaign in Norway, he was forced to resign. In his place, the one man who'd been unwavering in his opposition to Hitler was called to lead the nation, Winston Churchill. For Nancy Astor, this was a devastating political blow. The man she had spent 2 decades sparring with, a man whose worldview was the antithesis of her own, was now prime minister. Her direct line to the heart of government was severed. She was no longer a powerful insider, but a marginalized backbencher, forever branded as an appeaser. Her relationship with Churchill in the corridors of power, always frosty, now became glacial. He had a war to win, and he had little time or tolerance for the woman who had led the chorus of those who had sought to placate the dictator he was now sworn to destroy. Her voice in the House of Commons, once so powerful and piercing, lost much of its authority. The great debates were now about military strategy, industrial production, and national security, subjects on which she had little credibility. Her signature causes, like temperance and nursery schools, seemed to many like trivialities in the face of the existential threat posed by the Third Reich. She continued to speak, to heckle, to interject, but her words no longer carried the same weight. The political tide had turned, and she had been left stranded on the shore. But while her influence in Westminster waned, the war brought out another, more admirable side of her character, her profound sense of duty and her incredible personal courage. Her constituency of Plymouth Sutton was not an abstract political territory. It was a front-line target. As a major naval base, Plymouth became one of the most heavily bombed cities in Britain during the Blitz. Nancy refused to abandon her people. While other politicians might have remained in the relative safety of London or their country estates, she and Waldorf made a point of being in Plymouth during the worst of the raids. The stories from this period are remarkable. She was utterly fearless. In the terrifying aftermath of a bombing, she would be one of the first on the scene, clambering over rubble in her elegant clothes to offer comfort to the survivors and assistance to the rescue workers. She opened canteens and hostels for those who had been bombed out of their homes. She would stand in the smoking ruins of a street, listen to the grievances of her constituents, and then march off to harangue a minister or a bureaucrat to get them the help they needed. She shared their danger, and they loved her for it. In the darkest days of the Blitz, the lady from Plymouth rediscovered her purpose, not as a grand political influencer, but as a fierce and tireless protector of her community. This tireless work in Plymouth earned her the undying loyalty of her constituents. It was perhaps her finest hour, but while she was cementing her status as a local hero on the national stage, the political ground was shifting beneath her feet. The courage she showed in the Blitz could not erase the memory of Cliveden, and as the end of the war approached, the political establishment, including her own husband, began to feel that her time was up. For 6 long years, Nancy continued this dual life, politically marginalized in London, but a beloved and courageous figure in war-torn Plymouth. As the war in Europe finally drew to a close, in the spring of 1945, the nation began to look toward the future. A general election was called, the first in a decade. It was assumed that Nancy, who had held her seat for an astonishing 26 years, would stand for re-election. But it was not to be. The decision was not hers to make. It was her husband, Waldorf, who delivered the final painful blow to her political career. For some time, he had been growing increasingly concerned about her. The strain of the war years, combined with her increasingly erratic public behavior and outspokenness, had taken its toll. He worried about her health, but more than that, he was a political realist. He understood that the post-war world would have no place for his wife. The Britain of 1945 was on the cusp of a social revolution. The Beveridge Report had laid the groundwork for the welfare state and the National Health Service. The Labor Party was surging, offering a vision of a new, more equitable society. Nancy, with her aristocratic background, her pre-war reputation as an appeaser, and her often out-of-touch pronouncements, was seen as a relic of a discredited past. Waldorf knew she would likely lose the election, and he believed the humiliation of such a public rejection would be too much for her to bear. He decided it was better for her to retire with her long record intact. He formally requested that she not stand for re-election. For Nancy, this was the ultimate betrayal. She was a fighter who had never backed down from a challenge in her life. The idea of voluntarily quitting, of being pushed out by her own husband, was anathema to her. She was reportedly incandescent with rage, her pride deeply wounded. She felt that Waldorf was stripping her of her identity, taking away the public stage that had defined her existence for over a quarter of a century. The arguments were fierce and painful, but in the end, she reluctantly agreed. In a tearful farewell speech to her constituents in Plymouth, she announced her retirement. Her departure from the House of Commons was quiet, almost an afterthought in the seismic political shifts of 1945 that would sweep Churchill from power and usher in a radical labor government. The pioneering firebrand, the first woman to ever take her seat, left the political arena not with a bang, but with a sense of quiet, personal tragedy. Her historic career was over. For a personality as dynamic and restless as Nancy Astor, retirement was never going to be a peaceful affair. To be deprived of the political stage, the daily combat of the commons, and the public platform she had commanded for so long, left a profound void in her life. She was a performer without a theater, a warrior without a war. Her immense energy, now untethered from the discipline of parliamentary life, often manifested in aimless and increasingly eccentric behavior. She continued to travel, to give speeches, and to write letters to the editors of newspapers, but her interventions often seemed out of touch with the rapidly changing post-war world. The Britain of the 1950s and 60s, with its new social freedoms and declining deference, was a foreign country to her. Her rigid moral certainties and her aristocratic worldview seemed increasingly anachronistic. She continued to make headlines, but often for the wrong reasons, with shocking or bizarre statements that caused embarrassment to her family. Her private life was also marked by sorrow. Her relationship with her children was often fraught with difficulty. Her eldest son, Bobby Shaw, from her first marriage, was a deeply troubled man who struggled with alcoholism, his sexuality, and his place in the world, issues for which his mother, with her rigid Christian Scientist beliefs, had little compassion or understanding. Her political convictions had always been stronger than her maternal instincts, and in her old age the consequences of this became painfully clear. She and Waldorf lived out their final years together, but his death in 1952 left her truly unmoored. She became a lonely figure, a living legend who had outlived her era. She was the singing Swan, now old and frail, her song a faint and sometimes confusing echo of what it once had been. The woman who had been at the center of the world for so long now found herself on its periphery, watching a future that she had helped to shape but no longer understood. Her public life was over. All that remained was for the world to grapple with the complex, brilliant, and deeply flawed legacy she would leave behind. We left Nancy Astor in the long, restless twilight of her life. The political stage she had commanded for a quarter of a century was gone. Her husband and partner, Waldorf, had passed away, and the new modern Britain of the post-war era was a world she no longer fully recognized or understood. She was a living monument from a bygone age, a figure of both admiration and notoriety. On May 2, 1964, at the age of 84, Nancy Astor died, bringing to a close one of the most dynamic, controversial, and historically significant lives of the 20th century. Her death closed the final chapter on a human story, but it opened the enduring debate about her legacy. How should history remember this woman of breathtaking contradictions? Was she the courageous democratic pioneer who shattered one of the oldest barriers in the world? Or was she the prejudiced aristocrat, the dangerously misguided appeaser who cozied up to the forces of darkness? The truth, as is so often the case, is that she was all of these things at once. To understand her legacy is to embrace the uncomfortable, messy, and profoundly human complexity of her life. It is difficult, from our modern vantage point, to fully appreciate the courage it took, the sheer force of will required for a woman to walk into that hostile chamber and take a seat among hundreds of men who believed with every fiber of their being that she did not belong there. She endured their scorn, their silence, and their condescension, and by simply refusing to leave, she normalized the presence of women in the halls of power. She was the proof of concept, the one who demonstrated that a woman could not only survive in that brutal arena, but could thrive. She did not pull the ladder up behind her. In her own cantankerous and often difficult way, she served as a mentor and an inspiration to the small handful of women who followed her into Parliament over the next 2 decades. She fought for them to have proper facilities and to be treated with a modicum of respect. She created a path, however narrow and treacherous, for others to follow. Every woman who has since served in the British Parliament, from the back benches to the Prime Minister's office, walks in the footsteps of the fiery lady from Virginia. And her pioneering spirit was not merely symbolic. She used her platform to champion causes that the male establishment had long neglected. Her successful campaign to raise the drinking age was a direct result of her bringing a woman's perspective on the social damage of alcoholism to the forefront. Her relentless advocacy for nursery schools and child welfare placed the needs of the youngest and most vulnerable members of society onto the political agenda. As the Member of Parliament for Plymouth, she was a model of constituency service, fighting tirelessly for the sailors, the dock workers, and the families who depended on her. She may have been a viscountess, but she never lost the ability to connect with and fight for ordinary people. She proved that a woman's voice in politics was not a novelty, but a necessity, bringing with it a different set of priorities and a different kind of power. However, to celebrate the pioneer without acknowledging the deep and disturbing flaws in her character would be to tell a sanitized and dishonest story. Nancy Astor's legacy is forever stained by her catastrophic errors in judgment and her deeply ingrained prejudices. Her role as a leading voice for the policy of appeasement in the 1930s cannot be excused by her stated desire for peace. Her blindness to the true nature of Hitler's regime, a blindness born of a pathological fear of communism and an aristocratic naivete, made her complicit in a policy that emboldened a tyrant and led the world to the brink of destruction. The Cliveden Set, with her as its vivacious hostess, will forever be a byword for the disastrous miscalculations of a privileged elite. Even more damning were her personal bigotries. Her anti-Catholicism was not a passing quirk, but a consistent and ugly feature of her public pronouncements. And her anti-Semitism was a profound moral failing that is impossible to defend or ignore. In a decade when Jewish people in Europe were being systematically stripped of their rights and targeted for extermination for a prominent British politician to be voicing anti-Semitic sentiments was not just offensive, it was inexcusable. These were not minor character flaws. They were a poison in her political soul, revealing the profound limits of her empathy and her understanding of the world. This is the central, uncomfortable paradox of Lady Astor. She was a progressive who fought for the rights of women, but a reactionary who harbored deep animosity towards Catholics and Jews. She was a social reformer who cared deeply about the welfare of poor children, but also an elitist who was dangerously out of touch with the great geopolitical currents of her time. She was capable of great courage and great compassion, but also of stunning intolerance and intellectual blindness. To grapple with her legacy is to hold these two irreconcilable truths in your hands at the same time. In the end, we return to Truman Capote's brilliant and piercing observation. Nancy is a singing swan, but every time she sings, the whole lake wants to run away. Her life was that song. The swan itself, her arrival in public life, was a thing of groundbreaking beauty and grace. Parts of her song, her advocacy for the vulnerable, were clear and melodious, but other parts were discordant, shrill, and jarring. The notes of prejudice, the aria of appeasement, the desire for the lake to run away, was the world recoiling from those ugly sounds. Nancy Astor's story is not a simple morality tale. It is a lesson in the complexity of human nature and the untidy reality of history. It reminds us that our heroes are rarely perfect, that pioneers who push humanity forward in one direction can be stubbornly, even dangerously, stuck in the past in others. She forces us to ask difficult questions. Can we admire someone's courage while deploring their beliefs? How do we weigh a person's historic achievements against their historic failures? Her life serves as a timeless cautionary tale about the dangers of self-righteousness, the seductive power of influence, and the moral obligation to confront our own blind spots. She was a woman who kicked open a door that had been barred for centuries, but she carried through it the heavy baggage of the flawed world that had produced her.